6 months had passed since Earth's retaliation, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Veth Dominion had collapsed into civil war as species they had conquered for millennia rose up with a ferocity born from generations of oppression, their subject worlds burning with rebellion now that the invincible empire had been proven mortal by a species that should have been helpless. Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin, now bearing the title of High Commissioner of the Compact of the Overlooked, stood at the window of her office on the newly constructed Unity Station and watched ships from 30 different species dock at the sprawling facility that humanity had built in neutral space. The Compact had grown faster than anyone expected, with civilizations that the Forum had ignored for centuries flocking to join an alliance that promised actual protection rather than empty words and diplomatic posturing. Commissioner Seo-jin reviewed reports from across Compact territory, documents that told the story of former Veth slave worlds being redistributed to the species that had been forced to serve, of trade routes being established between civilizations that had never been allowed to communicate, of a new order rising from the ashes of 10,000 years of predation. Her aide, a young officer named Choi Yoonji, entered with a tablet containing the day's briefings. The Forum has requested another meeting, Yoonji reported, her voice carefully neutral in the way that Seo-jin had learned meant she was holding back an opinion. They want to discuss terms for potential cooperation between the Forum and the Compact. Seo-jin smiled without humor, remembering the faces of delegates who had walked out of the chamber while her world burned, who had offered condolences instead of help, who had assumed that humanity would simply accept its extinction with quiet dignity. "Tell them I will consider their request," she said, knowing that making them wait was a small revenge but finding satisfaction in it nonetheless across the galaxy. The Forum species who had betrayed Earth faced economic isolation as the Compact refused all contact, their trade networks crumbling as former partners chose to align with an alliance that had proven itself willing to fight for its members, the species that had sold humanity's coordinates to the Veth had been expelled from the Forum entirely, their homeworld now surrounded by Compact ships that watched every movement without ever making threats. A silent reminder that some debts could not be forgiven, even if they would not be collected through violence on Earth. General Park Min-ji walked through the streets of Seoul, rebuilt but still bearing scars from the orbital bombardment that had killed millions before Project Aegis had turned the tide. She stopped at a memorial that listed the names of everyone who had died during the invasion, a wall of stone that stretched for kilometers and still was not long enough to hold all the names of the fallen. A young girl approached her, no more than 8 years old, and offered a flower with the serious expression of someone who understood that the general had saved her world but also knew that saving had come at a terrible cost. Park accepted the flower and placed it at the base of the memorial, adding it to the thousands of others that visitors had left over the past months. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked quietly, though she was not sure who she was asking or what answer she hoped to receive. The galaxy had watched humanity reveal weapons that could destroy fleets and reshape the balance of power among the stars. And now every species looked at Earth differently than they had before. Some looked with fear, wondering if the humans would become the next Veth. Another predator that would feed on the weak others looked with hope, seeing in humanity a protector that might finally make the galaxy safer for those who could not protect themselves. Park did not know which vision would prove true, and the uncertainty weighed on her more heavily than any battle she had ever fought back on Unity Station. Commissioner Seo-jin received word that a young Kavathi diplomat had arrived requesting a meeting. Carrying what she claimed was an unofficial message from the elder species, Seo-jin agreed to see her, more out of curiosity than any expectation that the meeting would be productive. The Kavathi, who entered her office, was young by her species standards, barely 500 years old, and she moved with a nervous energy that the elder delegates had long since lost. "High Commissioner," the diplomat began, her voice carrying uncertainty that would have been unthinkable from a Kolvathi just months ago. "I have been sent to convey a message that my elders cannot deliver themselves, because they do not know how to say it." Seojin gestured for her to continue. Keeping her expression neutral, "They wish to apologize," the Kolvathi said. And the words seemed to cost her something to speak, not because they fear humanity's power, though they do, but because they have had time to reflect on what they did when your world was burning, and they realize now that they were wrong. "Apologies are easy," Seojin replied, her voice cool but not hostile. "What do they want?" "They want to discuss terms," the diplomat admitted, "not as equals demanding concessions, but as those who failed asking how they might begin to make amends." Seojin considered the offer for a long moment, thinking about everything humanity had lost and everything they had gained, about the galaxy that had abandoned them and the galaxy they were now building. "Tell your elders that I will listen," she finally said, "but I make no promises, because trust that has been broken cannot be rebuilt with words alone." The Kolvathi nodded and departed, leaving Seojin alone with her thoughts as the sun set over Unity Station and cast long shadows across her office. She looked out at the ships from 30 worlds, at the alliance that humanity had built from nothing, at the future that no one had thought possible just 6 months ago. The universe had fallen silent after Earth unleashed its retaliation. But now that silence was filling with new voices, species that had been overlooked finally being heard, civilizations that had been abandoned finally finding protection. Humanity had not become monsters, had not become the next Veth, had not used their power to conquer and consume. Instead, they had built something new, something better, something that might actually make the galaxy worth living in for everyone. And as the stars came out over Unity Station, Commissioner Seojin allowed herself to hope that the silence of the universe was not the silence of fear, but the silence of a galaxy learning, for the first time, what it meant to have protectors who kept their promises. The broadcast cut through every frequency in the galaxy simultaneously, overriding local transmissions and emergency channels with a signal so powerful that no one could ignore it. Even if they wanted to, General Park Minji appeared on screens across 1,000 worlds, her face illuminated by the blue glow of tactical displays in an underground bunker that looked like it had been built to survive the end of everything. She was not young, with gray streaking her short hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of service. But she stood with the straight spine of a soldier who had never learned how to surrender. "My name is General Park Minji, Commander of Earth's Unified Defense Forces," she said in a voice that carried across the void of space without a tremor of fear or doubt. 3 days ago, the Veth Dominion attacked our world without provocation, without warning, and without mercy. Behind her, screens showed orbital footage of the Veth fleet. 3,000 warships arranged in perfect formation around Earth, like a noose waiting to be tightened. They expected us to fall like every species before us. Barr continued, and something cold and hard entered her voice. They were wrong. The footage shifted to show ground combat in human cities. But this time, the images were not the carefully edited propaganda that the Veth had been broadcasting to the galaxy. These images showed Veth soldiers being cut down in ambush, their advanced armor useless against traps that had been set by people who knew every street and every building. Their supply convoys burning on highways while human fighters melted back into the shadows. Humanity has survived ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed us a dozen times over, Park said as the footage continued to play. We did not achieve this by being gentle or forgiving, or by accepting that our destruction was inevitable. She turned to face a different camera. and her eyes seemed to look directly at every being watching across the galaxy. The Veth believed they were harvesting a primitive species that had barely learned to leave its own planet. But they made a critical error in their assessment. The screens behind her changed again, now showing something that made forum analysts across the galaxy lean forward in disbelief. Weapons. Platforms were emerging from hidden positions throughout the Sol system, from beneath the surface of moons and from within asteroid fields and from locations that no galactic survey had ever detected for 60 years. Humanity has been preparing for this day, Park explained as the footage showed platform after platform activating in a coordinated sequence that spoke of planning on a scale that should have been impossible to hide. We knew that the universe was not empty, and we knew that not everything out there would be friendly. So we built Project Aegis in secret while showing the galaxy only what we wanted them to see. The weapons platforms began to fire, and the energy signatures that erupted from them made the readings that had been detected near Jupiter look like sparks compared to a bonfire. Beams of light that seemed to bend space itself lanced out toward the Veth fleet, and ships that had conquered dozens of worlds began to break apart like toys in the hands of an angry child. "You watched," Park said, and now her voice carried an accusation that cut deeper than any weapon. "The Galactic Forum received our calls for help, and you watched as our cities burned, and you did nothing because you believed we were already dead." The footage showed the Veth flagship, the massive vessel from which Archon Velith had commanded the conquest of Earth. As it tried to maneuver away from the weapons fire that was tearing his fleet apart, Archon Velith is dead, Park announced without emotion. His flagship was destroyed 14 hours ago, and his remaining forces are being systematically eliminated as I speak. The screen showed the flagship breaking apart in silence, its hull splitting open to expose the void within and across the galaxy. Every species that had ever feared the Veth watched their nightmare die in the cold emptiness of space. Earth was willing to join the galactic community peacefully, Park continued, and her voice softened just slightly before hardening again into something that made even the eldest species shiver. "We wanted to trade and explore and learn from civilizations older and wiser than ourselves. But that offer has been withdrawn." She paused, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire universe. Humanity will not forget that we were abandoned in our hour of need. That species with the power to help us chose instead to look away and wait for our extinction. The footage behind her now showed the full scope of Project Aegis. Hundreds of platforms working in perfect coordination to reduce the mightiest fleet in galactic history to scattered debris and fading radiation. "We do not seek revenge against those who failed us," Park said, though her tone suggested that mercy was a choice rather than an obligation. "But we will never, again, trust our survival to the goodwill of those who prove themselves willing to watch children die rather than risk their own comfort." The final image of the broadcast showed Earth from orbit, battered and scarred, but still intact, still alive, still defiant against everything the universe had thrown at it. "This message is both an announcement and a warning," Park concluded. "Humanity survived, and humanity remembers, and the next time someone threatens our world, we will not wait for help that will never come." The broadcast ended, and across 1,000 worlds, every screen returned to local programming as if nothing had happened. But nothing was the same. In the forum chamber, delegates sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed, unable to reconcile the primitive species they had dismissed with the power they had just seen demonstrated. Ambassador Yum Seo-jin stood at the entrance to the chamber, watching the faces of beings who had offered her condolences and then walked away. And she felt no satisfaction in their shock, only a cold certainty that everything had changed. The universe had fallen silent. And in that silence, humanity began to plan what came next. The galactic community expected humanity to retreat after its victory, to focus on rebuilding shattered cities and mourning the dead, to be quietly grateful for survival and fade back into obscurity. Instead, Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin returned to the forum chamber 1 week after the broadcast and requested the floor with a formal tone that made several elder delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The forum recognizes the representative of Earth, the Kovathi moderator announced, his voice carrying none of the dismissive pity it had held. Just days before, Seo-jin walked to the central platform with a datapad in her hands and a cold fire burning in her eyes that made even the oldest species present feel suddenly uncertain about what was coming. "I am here to present evidence of a crime," she said, and her voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of someone who had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in her mind. A crime that the forum has enabled through its silence and its cowardice for longer than humanity has existed. The display behind her activated to show records extracted from captured VETH data cores, files that had been secured by human forces during the final hours of the invasion before the enemy fleet was destroyed. The VETH Dominion did not find Earth by accident. Seo-jin continued as the data scrolled across the screens. They were given our coordinates by a member species of this forum, a civilization that saw humanity as potential competition and decided to eliminate us before we could become a threat. The chamber erupted in shouting as delegates accused each other and demanded proof, and insisted that such a betrayal was impossible. But Seo-jin simply waited until the noise died down before presenting the evidence in methodical detail. Communication logs showed negotiations between the VETH and a forum member, with Earth's location being traded for economic concessions and territorial guarantees that would never need to be honored once humanity was gone. But the betrayal of my species is not the only crime I am here to address, Seo-jin said once she had named the guilty party and watched them escorted from the chamber by forum security. The VETH data cores contained something else, something that implicates every civilization in this room. The display changed to show records of tribute payments made to the VETH Dominion over thousands of years, resources and technology and information provided by forum members in exchange for being left alone while other species were harvested. "You knew?" Seo-jin said, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. Every civilization in this forum knew what the VETH were doing, knew that innocent species were being conquered and consumed, and you paid them to look the other way. She let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until delegates who had existed for millennia found themselves unable to meet the eyes of a human who had been alive for barely 4 decades. "Humanity demands accountability," Seo-jin announced, not just from the VETH, who were already paying for their crimes, but from every civilization that enabled their predation through silence and compliance before anyone could respond. Sensors throughout the forum detected the arrival of ships at the edge of the station's territory, and delegates rushed to viewing ports to see something that should have been impossible. A human fleet had emerged from fold space. Dozens of warships constructed in secret shipyards beneath the surface of Luna. Vessels that bristled with weapons that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. "These ships are not here to threaten the forum," Seo-jin clarified as panic began to spread through the chamber. "They are here to demonstrate that humanity's victory over the VETH was not a fluke, not a desperate gamble that somehow succeeded against all odds." She walked toward the viewing port and looked out at the fleet that represented everything her species had built while the galaxy assumed they were primitive and harmless. "We have the power to do what the VETH did," she said quietly. "We could conquer, could demand tribute, could make every civilization in this forum pay for abandoning us when we needed help. Delegates held their breath, waiting for the threat that seemed inevitable, waiting for humanity to become the new predator that the galaxy would learn to fear. But we will not, Seojin continued. And she turned back to face the chamber with something in her expression that was harder to read than simple anger or vengeance. Humanity did not survive everything we have survived just to become another monster. Another empire that feeds on the weak and makes the galaxy darker than it already is. She returned to the central platform and stood tall before the assembly of species that had written off her. People is already dead. What we demand is simple, she said. The Forum must choose what kind of galaxy it wants to live in. Whether it will continue to enable predators like the Veth through cowardice and complicity, or whether it will finally stand for something more than its own survival. The Corvusy moderator, oldest of the elder species, rose slowly from his platform and approached Seojin with movements that showed every one of his thousands of years. And if we choose poorly? He asked, his voice carrying genuine uncertainty for perhaps the first time in centuries. Seojin looked at him with eyes that had seen her world burn while he offered empty condolences. And she smiled without warmth. Then humanity will build something new without you, she said. We've already begun reaching out to species that the Forum has ignored. Civilizations too small or too weak or too young to matter to the elder races. And they are eager to join an alliance that will actually protect its members. She pulled up one final display, showing communications from dozens of minor species, all of them responding to humanity's offer of mutual defense and cooperation. The Compact of the Overlooked will exist whether the Forum joins it or not. Seojin concluded. The only question is whether the elder species will be part of the new order, or whether they will be left behind by the galaxy they failed to protect. She walked out of the chamber without waiting for a response, leaving the most powerful civilizations in known space to contemplate a future they had never imagined. One where humanity was not a victim to be pitied, but a force that would reshape everything. 3 days passed with no word from Earth, and the galaxy assumed that humanity had fallen like every species before them. The Veth Dominion broadcast triumphant updates, showing burning cities and captured territories. Their propaganda machine working with the efficiency of an empire that had perfected the art of conquest over 10,000 years of practice. Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin watched these broadcasts from her quarters on Station Corinth, refusing to leave even as other diplomats sent messages suggesting she might want to find somewhere else to stay now that her civilization no longer existed. She ignored them all because something about the Veth broadcast did not feel right. The footage they showed was repetitive in ways that bothered her analytical mind, with the same burning buildings appearing in multiple segments that were supposedly filmed days apart. And the soldiers in the ground combat recordings seemed confused rather than victorious. Senior analyst Baek Jin-ho, one of the few humans stationed at the Forum's intelligence division, arrived at her quarters on the third night with dark circles under his eyes and a datapad clutched in his hands like a lifeline. The Veth have stopped responding to Forum diplomatic channels, he said as he entered, his voice carrying an urgency that made Seojin sit up straighter in her chair. Arkan Velith himself has not been seen in any of the recent broadcasts, and their military communications have become increasingly chaotic. Seojin took the datapad from him and scrolled through intercepted transmissions that had been partially decoded by Forum intelligence systems, and her eyes widened as she recognized words that should not have appeared in reports from a conquered world underground. Insurgency, traps, ambush, retreat. These were not the words of an army that had achieved total victory over a helpless population. The Corvati listening post near Proxima Centauri picked up something else. Baek continued, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. Even though they were alone, energy readings from the Sol system that do not match any known Veth technology. Coming from somewhere near Jupiter, before Seojin could respond, a personal communicator activated with an incoming encrypted transmission using codes that only Earth's emergency government should have possessed. The message was brief. Just 8 words that changed everything she thought she knew about the situation. Hold position, Ambassador. Because broadcast incoming. She looked at Beak and saw her own mixture of hope and fear reflected in his eyes. And they both turned toward the window that faced the direction of Earth, even though they could see nothing but distant stars and the void between them across the galaxy. Other species were also beginning to notice the inconsistencies in the Veth narrative, and intelligence analysts from a dozen civilizations were asking questions that the Dominion seemed unable or unwilling to answer. The Korvathi delegate, who had offered Seojin his condolences 3 days earlier, requested access to raw sensor data from the Sol system, and when the Veth refused to provide it, the ancient diplomat felt the first stirrings of doubt in his assessment of humanity's fate. Something was wrong with the conquest of Earth. And the more the elder species examined the evidence, the less the official story made sense in the forum chamber. Delegates gathered to discuss rumors that were spreading faster than anyone could contain them. Whispers of Veth ground forces being slaughtered in urban combat against enemies who refused to surrender. Of supply lines being cut by attacks that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The Veth had conquered 47 species over their long history, and every single one of them had followed the same pattern of initial resistance followed by rapid collapse once the population understood that defeat was inevitable. Humanity was not following the pattern. The humans were not accepting that defeat was inevitable, and they were making the Veth pay for every street and every building and every inch of ground with blood and fire, and a ferocity that the Dominion had never encountered. The Forsaken received fragmented reports from human resistance cells that had somehow managed to establish communication relays through captured Veth equipment, and the stories they told painted a picture of a species that had decided death was preferable to submission. Farmers were fighting with hunting rifles against soldiers in powered armor. Teachers were organizing civilian evacuation networks through subway tunnels and sewer systems. Children were serving as messengers and scouts because the Veth had not yet learned to see them as threats. The whole planet had become a trap, and the Veth were only beginning to understand how badly they had underestimated their prey on the evening of the 3rd day. Every sensor in the galaxy detected an energy signature building near Jupiter that defied explanation. A concentration of power that should not have been possible for a species that had only achieved interstellar capability within the past century. The elder species who had dismissed humanity as brave but primitive suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that they had been wrong, that the humans had been hiding something, that the sheep they had abandoned to the wolves might have been wolves themselves all along. Forum delegates rushed to their observation posts as the energy readings continued to climb, and Seojin stood at her window watching the stars with tears streaming down her face, because she finally understood what her people had been doing while the galaxy looked away. They had been preparing for years. For decades, humanity had known that the universe was not a friendly place, that there were predators among the stars who would see their world as nothing more than a meal to be consumed, and they had built something in secret, something hidden from the galactic surveys, something that was about to change everything the universe thought it knew about the small blue planet called Earth. The energy signature near Jupiter reached its peak, and across the galaxy, every screen and every sensor and every communication device fell silent as humanity prepared to announce its survival in a way that no one would ever forget. Ambassador Seojin wiped the tears from her eyes and smiled. The broadcast was coming. The message arrived on every screen across the galaxy at the same moment. And Ambassador Yoon Seojin felt her blood turn cold as she watched from her small office on Station Corinth. The Veth Dominion had claimed Earth. The transmission showed 3,000 warships entering the Sol system in perfect formation, their dark holes blocking out the stars like a spreading stain across the void of space. And the voice that accompanied the images was calm and almost bored as it announced that humanity had been designated for harvesting. Seojin stood frozen for only a moment before she ran toward the forum chamber, her boots echoing against the metal floors as diplomats from 100 different species stepped aside to let her pass. Their eyes filled with something she recognized immediately as pity. The Galactic Forum was the closest thing the universe had to a governing body that would govern nothing and enforced even less, serving mainly as a place where elder species could discuss trade, agreements, and territorial disputes while younger civilizations watched and learned their place in the cosmic order. Seojin burst through the chamber doors to find the massive circular room already filled with delegates, all of them watching the same transmission on the central display, and none of them doing anything to stop it. "I demand emergency intervention," she shouted, a voice cutting through the murmurs that filled the room. And every alien face turned toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to embarrassment to something that looked almost like shame. The Korvathi delegate, an ancient being whose species had traveled between stars when humans still lived in caves, rose slowly from his floating platform and addressed the chamber in a voice heavy with what he probably thought was compassion. "Ambassador Seojin, the Forum extends its deepest sympathies to humanity during this difficult transition," he said. And the words made her want to scream, because they were already speaking about her people in the past tense. "Transition?" she repeated, her hands gripping the railing of her platform so hard that her knuckles turned white. And she could feel the eyes of every delegate boring into her as she struggled to keep her composure. "The Veth Dominion has conquered 47 species over the past 10,000 years," the Korvathi continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone explaining an unfortunate but unchangeable truth to a child who simply did not understand the way things worked. "They possess technology and military strength that none of us can match, and any interference would simply add our worlds to their list of targets." Seojin looked around the chamber at the representatives of civilizations that had existed for millennia, species that commanded fleets of thousands and controlled resources beyond human imagination. And she saw nothing but cowardice dressed up as wisdom. "You have the power to stop this," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to remain strong. And she pointed at the display where Veth ships were now entering orbit around Earth. "Together, your combined forces could overwhelm them, could drive them back, could save 8 billion innocent people from whatever horror awaits them." The silence that followed her words was the loudest thing she had ever heard. One by one, the delegates began to leave, some offering apologetic gestures, and others simply turning away as if she had already ceased to exist. And Seojin watched them go with a growing numbness spreading through her chest. Her personal communicator buzzed with an incoming transmission from Earth, and she accepted it with trembling hands to see fragmented footage of coastal cities burning under orbital bombardment, of people running through streets filled with smoke and debris, of her homeworld dying while the galaxy watched and did nothing. The Korvathi delegate paused at the door, his ancient eyes meeting hers with something that might have been genuine sorrow. "Your species accomplished remarkable things in such a short time," he said, and his voice carried the tone of someone delivering a eulogy for the already dead. "Humans were brave and curious and full of potential, and the galaxy will remember you fondly, even if briefly." Seojin stared at him for a long moment. This being who had watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore and she felt something shift inside her that she could not quite name. "You should have helped us," she said quietly. And her voice no longer trembled because something harder had replaced her fear. "Now you will have to watch." The Kovathi tilted his head in confusion at her words, clearly not understanding what she meant. And she did not bother to explain because the truth was that she did not fully understand it herself. All she knew was that humanity had not survived ice ages and plagues and wars and its own worst impulses, just to be harvested like cattle by creatures who saw them as nothing more than resources to be consumed. The chamber emptied completely, leaving Saijin alone with the images of destruction playing across the central display. And she stood there for hours, watching her world burn while the rest of the galaxy went about its business, as if nothing important was happening. She received scattered updates throughout the night as Earth's orbital defenses fell one by one and ground forces began landing on every continent. And each message was more desperate than the last as military commanders reported losses that seemed impossible to survive. But there was something strange in the final transmissions, something that did not quite fit the pattern of total defeat that the Veth broadcasts were showing to the galaxy. The last message she received before communications went dark came from someone she did not recognize. A voice filled with exhaustion, but also with something else that took her a moment to identify. It was not despair. Ambassador Saojin. The voice said through static and interference, "Maintain your position and await further instructions. Because this is not over." The transmission cut out, and Saojin was left standing in the empty chamber with nothing but silence and the distant hum of the station's life support systems for company. She should have felt hopeless, should have been preparing herself for the death of everything she had ever loved. But instead, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories of the old wars on Earth. Her grandmother had always said that the most dangerous thing in the universe was a human who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Saojin looked up at the display one final time, watching the Veth ships circle her homeworld like predators waiting to feed. And she smiled despite everything because she knew something that the galaxy did not. Humanity had faced extinction before, had stared into the void and refused to blink, and had always found a way to survive when survival seemed impossible. The Veth thought they were harvesting sheep, but they had walked into a den of wolves who had simply been pretending to be tame. And now the wolves were awake.